Among so many things, so many topics decisively opened, reshaped, shared, Nancy was a thinker of appearance, of emergence, of the birth to presence, of comparence, comparution, as he called it with Jean-Christophe Bailly, existence as exposure in finitude to other beings and with other beings, to the infinitude of sense, of appearance and withdrawal then, of the withdrawal thanks to which there is appearance as exposure in finitude, the withdrawal of the gods one day, which opens adoration, freeing it from mythical determination, opening the relation to presence as transimmanence, relation as adoration, the withdrawal of community as co-belonging, always already and again as task, as duty even, the unworking of community as the sharing of finitude, the withdrawal of sense, opening spacing. A thinker of appearance then, and withdrawal, of disappearance also. Not often, it must be said. Happily, Nancy's negativity is invariably restless, that other side which opens also here in spacing and exposure. On occasion, though, a thinker of disappearance, including at times of disappearance as loss of this person, this being, beloved, and no more, of that experience of loss in whose wake we have gathered here, disparately, to salute and celebrate Nancy as philosopher, friend, and inspiration. In a finite thinking, Nancy reads Georges Bataille and thinks about the exorbitantly immediate relation to which Bataille laid claim between his writings and his life, to which he laid claim in the wake of Nietzsche, inspired by and replaying Nietzsche's dramatizations in inscribing his own in the farce of that supposed immediacy. By the end of the essay Exscription, Nancy is reading Bataille, which is to say, the whole drama of this overblown inscription, with and after Blanchot, in particular the essay Friendship, in which Blanchot seeks a way to write on Bataille after Bataille's death. In his own essay, Nancy develops the figure of Exscription as a way to think about the relation between writing and life, existence, sense. So in what follows, I want to track Nancy's thinking of Exscription, in particular to suggest something of what, at its outer limits perhaps, it can offer to an understanding of the techniques and stakes of contemporary endeavors to affirm the worldliness, which is to say the relation to sense, of forms of life of all kinds. In this reading of Bataille, then, Nancy follows carefully the twists and turns of that farce by which Bataille denounces in writing the petty machinery by which writing inexorably neutralizes the experiential intensity that everywhere exceeds it. I speak only of lived experiences, writes Bataille, doing everything he can to press into a fantasy of existentially full speech the writing he knows will always resist this, which elsewhere he describes as masking a scream. But the romanticism of this inseparable pair, that denunciation and its failure through performative contradiction, is not enough for Nancy, nor, he says, was it enough for Bataille, although this is perhaps debatable. For the life this writing invokes is for Nancy of the order of sense. It is existence, not this or that existence, but the fact of existence, and the fact of the existence of anything you might care to mention, anything whose existing writing might seek to inscribe. In these terms, life, a life, say, a life lived, lived experiences, is to existence, as meaning, this or that meaning, determinate signification, is to sense. And the inscription of this or that life, like the inscription of this or that meaning, exscribes sense. Nancy writes, writing exscribes sense just as much as it inscribes significations. That writing exscribes sense means that, quoting Nancy, it shows that what it's about, the thing itself, Bataille's life or scream, and finally the existence of everything which is in question in the text, that all these are outside the text, take place outside writing. This is not the outside of a referent to which signification would refer, however, not even the real life of Bataille, signified by the words, my life. This outside is, Nancy says, the infinite withdrawal of sense by which each existence exists. Exscribing the withdrawal of sense, writing affirms existence. Excretion is not exteriority then. It is an indication of exteriority. As such, it takes place here, right here. The outside indicated by excretion, that infinite withdrawal of sense, is, in Nancy's phrase, entirely exscribed into the text. The withdrawal of sense opens within signification. Existence is affirmed, exscribed, in the writing not just of life, but also of a life lived, lived experiences. If this life is not the exteriority of existence indicated by excretion, nor is it solely the reference signified by these written signs, my life, this life, a life. It is also that which, through this referential relation, remains bound up with the sight of that excretion. Not the exteriority indicated then, but not cleanly extra-textual either. The biographical banality of a life is scattered around the edges of the opening of Excretion. So much detritus, without which there is no threshold, no right here as the site of this opening. Nancy's phrasings tell us something of this, removing the referent from itself and leaving its traces, leaving something still to mark an existence around the Excretion of existence. Thus, he writes, Bataille's scream is not masked or stifled. It makes itself heard as the scream that is not heard. Heard and unheard, something of the scream remains right here. The residue, its vestige, perhaps, the trace of its passage, of the passage and passing of its body, Bataille's body, any body, but still a body. The finite trampling of an Exscription of finitude, says Nancy. This is exasperating, he writes. Quote, in yet another sense, it is Bataille himself, dead. That is, the exasperation of every moment of reading in the certainty that the man who wrote what is being read existed, and the confounding evidence that the meaning of his work and the meaning of his life are the same nakedness, the same denuding of meaning, which distances them from each other as well, by the gap of an exscribing writing. This gap, I want to say, is the relation between the trace of a passage, a vestige, as Nancy defines it, and the fact of existence. And if I want to retain an emphasis on the passage of this body, of a life, for all that these are not what Excretion indicates, it is because this relation opens compellingly the question of which bodies and which lives might come to be inscribed in the sight of such Excretion, of which screams might persist, heard and unheard. Not the raw datum, material, concrete, says Nancy, but the trace of this, or its echoes, as the site from which the fact of existence is affirmed. And from this fact, this other fact of being singular plural, of community. Nancy writes, that there is being, or some being, or indeed beings, and in particular that there is us, our community of writing reading, that is what instigates all possible meanings. That is what is the very place of meaning, but which has no meaning. Right here, the very place of meaning, the singular fact that we exist as reading and writing. Community here is passing through language. we are, after all, thinking about writing. The fact of existence, of our existence, and however anthropologically this may be determined, is not here, though, in this language. In this language, we are inscribed in our fleeting disparity, the passings of our bodies, in flight or otherwise, whose traces all open to sense. Jean-Christophe Bailly, whom I mentioned earlier, opens his book, The Animal Side, with the scene of a passing, a flight, an encounter with our disparity. Bailly writes, "But now, from this world, someone emerges, a phantom, a beast, for only a beast can burst forth in this way. A deer has come out of the undergrowth. Frightened, it runs up the road, trapped between the hedgerows. Finally, another path opens up for the animal, and after hesitating ever so slightly, the deer plunges in and disappears. In no way had I entered that world. On the contrary, it was rather as if its strangeness had declared itself anew, a different posture, a different impetus, and quite simply, a different modality of being. Someone emerged, and its track, its vestige, its trace is here, not captured, but inscribed among what Bailly calls our passages, fleeting sovereignties, occasions, escapes, encounters. Inscribed to declare that, as Bailly says, there are those hearts, those existences. There is the whirlwind of all those lives and the beating of each and every heart. A passing life, the trace of whose flight affirms the fact of its existence, of our existence, and, if you like, of our community. Our disparate community of spacing, sharing, encounter, ungatherable exposure in common. Thinking of Bailly, of this deer, of vestiges and of flight, we might recall that when Nancy wrote the first version of The Inoperative Community in 1983, it was in response to an invitation from Bailly to contribute to an issue of the journal Aléa with the title La communauté, le nombre, community, number. Two terms we can read as in apposition. Community is numerous, necessarily, but as intention too, and Nancy, more than most, will have taught us this. Community, in what remains its dominant operative form at least, gathers plurality into unity, cuts into this number to divide it, distinguishing between those who count and those who don't, those who share in community and those with no share, as Rancière would come to put it. In the future, we will never stop, I presume, reading and thinking and counting too with him, wrote Derrida in On Touching Jean-Luc Nancy, in lines that are now all the more resonant. Counting with Nancy, we would need to say, first, that the plurality of singular beings will always overspill the unity that community invariably selects. In this sense, returning to the problematic of exscription, we would say that the finitude exscribed in writing, the exposure to existence and the exposure of existence to sense, is not amenable to determination in advance as the proper attribute of this or that type of being. As we've seen, exscription is an opening to and of infinitude, and this opening is inappropriable, including by a hierarchy of species difference. The exposure so exscribed might accordingly be that of any being whatsoever. When it comes to exposure, there are no degrees of relative richness and poverty. At which point, we might think about the resources that the figure of Excretion would offer for a thinking of ecopoetics. How might a plurality of singular beings of all kinds find itself inscribed in specifically human forms? Frequently, the response here is to position non-human beings as the next community to whom the privilege of representation might be granted, continuing that ongoing democratization of symbolic forms towards the inscription by anyone whatsoever of anything whatsoever in any way whatsoever, which for Rancière characterizes literary modernity. Non-human worlds would thus find themselves inscribed within human forms in a gesture motivated by faith in the empathy and consequently the more generous treatment called forth by imaginative identification. This response is, of course, essentially fanciful, not least in its apparent disregard for the uncomfortable 20th century revelation of the failure of symbolic forms as generators of empathy. It is also, and this is not coincidental, itself essentially appropriative, granting admission on the basis of imagined resemblance. As Claire Colebrook has observed with reference to forms of posthumanism, it is in this sense best considered a form of ultra-humanism. And it is against this expansionist regime of imaginative identification that we might bring forth the resources offered by Excretion for an ecopoetic thinking. These are, I think, twofold. First, in the thinking of Excretion, existences are inscribed not as sites of identification, but as traces of flight. The deer written into Bailly's text is not gathered into a community of resemblance, but honored in its passage. The vestige of this passage, that is, its writing, affirms its existence, its exposure to existence, as always elsewhere. The elsewhere, indeed, of this writing and of its beating heart, the whirlwind of all those lives, as the centrifuge of exposure. The deer's existence is written out of the text, inscribed in the text, alongside Bailly's existence, alongside mine and yours, as never here together, disparate. Second, unlike the too rapid folding of non-human existences into human representation, Nancy's thinking never effaces the site of specifically human symbolic production. Never as ontological distinction, always as specific responsibility. The responsibility to mark and remark the spacing of relation in and out of the lives of singular beings. This is how we should understand here Nancy's evocation of the community of Excretion, that there is us, our community. That, as he puts it in Being Singular Plural, when we humans say us, we say us for all beings one by one, each time in the singular of their essential plural. For, in the sense of towards, in favor of, on behalf of, and also, like Bailly with the deer, but also, as Susanna and Georgios have reminded us today, like Nancy with the stone and the planets, these mineral lives, in front of, exposed to all those beings whose multiple worlds form, as Nancy writes in The Sense of the World, a differential articulation of singularities that make sense in articulating themselves. Alongside so much else then, Nancy was also, always, a thinker of literature. As a site of privileged inquiry, certainly, but never as conferring privilege. Nancy's thinking will have many and multiple futures. Of this we may be sure. And one of these may perhaps be through the rigor it can bring to reflections on literary and other efforts to do justice to the plurality of singular beings and the multiplicity of worlds, to which Nancy's writing continues to do justice. So to close, I'd just like to read a few lines from Nancy's poem, Oh, les animaux de langue, Oh, the language animals. Written for Philip Warnell's film, Ming of Harlem, which features a tiger and an alligator. In this poem, Nancy works at the encounter and exposure which Derrida and, latterly, Anne Simon have caught in the figure of the animaux, exscribing the passage of these beings through his world and ours. So I quote Nancy. "O tiger, alligator, sovereign by your allure alone, by your stretches, by your leaps, by your sated sleep, by your starts, by your fury, your courage, your glory, which our tongues try to form in roughened rhymes, gnashing, scratching, roaring, rumbling repetitions, hoarse-tongued torsions, tongue behind words, in your mouth, which roars and which weeps, groans, moans, howls, cries from your tear-filled throat, tigrator, your throat, but no less mine, no less." Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for that phenomenal talk. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Yes, Paul.
Thank you, Martin, for this beautiful lecture. I wondered if you thought about the figure of flight that is present in the description or the analytics of Befindlichkeit in Sein und Zeit, where very famously the whole discovering, the whole realm of Dasein is in fact opened by flight, by running away, looking away. Well, I don't know.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, that's really interesting. I'm really grateful to you for making that connection. Because I must confess that I think I probably in using that word, I'm sure actually that I had Deleuze in mind primarily, and so but I'm very grateful to you for using specifically that phrase of running away, because of course in the Bailly scene that I quoted, then the deer is running away. And not actually following a line of flight. I mean, it in a sense, it finds a line of flight, that it manages to find a line of flight within the territory. But that's not quite the line of flight as Deleuze-Guattari think it, of course, where much more the territory is constituted in relation to a line of flight, which remains as a resource, as it were, in that sense. So I think I was thinking flight much more as, in positive terms, as something like running away towards, as it were, rather than running away. And that I wonder then if there's something that we could, it would be possible to take running away towards, back towards that more ontological existential dimension of flight and its significance. Then I need to give that a lot more thought, I think. But thank you very much for the connection. Yes.
Thank you. Actually, if I could ask one quick question before we move on. I was wondering if you've given much thought concerning the ecopoetic inscription to Derrida's comments in Geschlecht 3. When he's discussing Unterwegs zur Sprache, he talks about, in classical fashion for Derrida, how Heidegger makes this trifold division about the animal, stone, and human, or Dasein, in their relation to world. And Derrida there says in a very specific way that he'd prefer to go about it by showing a difference rather than an abyss between in engrammatic capacity, which I found very like a nice language that I haven't really seen much in Derrida. Yeah, and I guess I was wondering how you would compare that to your comment about how it'd be difficult to differentiate between the exposure between different types of beings being exposed. How can one actually differentiate that with this question of differences of degree in engrammatic capacity.
Thanks, Donovan. Yes, again, that's a lovely connection. And yes, Geschlecht is very resonant here, isn't it, in lots of ways. So yes, I mean, I think the one of the things that keeps me coming back to Nancy around these questions is that he operates something like a double move, I think, that is, I find enormously helpful, actually. In that there is, as I trying to say, to an extent there is, on the one hand, there is, yes, a kind of refusal of hierarchy. And so a refusal of those kind of, that sort of drastic, categorical differentiation between different orders of being, let's say. And an affirmation, obviously, as we've been saying for over the course of these 2 days, an affirmation of relation and of differentiation as spacing, and therefore as relation and as exposure, and so on. But what he also does, and this is where I think his thinking has a particular rigor that various other approaches to some of these problems don't have, is he doesn't necessarily, because of that, abandon all and any thought of specific difference. And that would also be a mistake. And that also is a betrayal of singularity and precisely of relationality and so on. So the question then is attempting to think specific difference without hierarchy, which obviously we're very bad at doing. But Nancy is better at doing it than most. And I think I've always thought that there are some, the closer Nancy gets to Logos, the closer he gets to the risk of hierarchy, I think. But I think he always resists that risk also, and in some places very powerfully, and in some places slightly less powerfully, let's say. But I find that combination of an insistence on what other contexts would think of as a kind of ontological egalitarianism, but a maintenance of specific responsibility, which can pass via specific capacities, of course, extremely helpful. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. And Georgios?
Yes, just a little finger on this last comment. There is this essay by Jean-Luc Nancy of The One of Hierarchy, where he offers this very strange vindication of hierarchy that actually in the past I have also followed, which I find very beautiful, but it's also in a very familiar Nancy way, where he takes the word and kind of empties it out of its traditional way. But it's difficult, you know, how can you carry forward a word like hierarchy?
Yeah, it was interesting earlier, thinking about questions of horizontality and verticality and relationality as well. Yeah, that it's clearly connected to that kind of problematic as well. And again, you know, Nancy isn't a wholly horizontal thinker, I don't think, in various ways. But then it's a question of, I mean, then we're getting into very kind of, in a sense, in relation to those kind of figures, then, you know, there are fairly straightforward deconstructive ways of doing this in terms of, as you say, Georgios, you know, taking the term and emptying it out, and so on. But again, I quite like that, you know, that one thing that's been going on through all of these discussions, I think, as well, is maintaining some of these problems as a sign of just how this is precisely why why we remain within his thought, isn't it? I think that there is that. It's not enough, as it were, to disavow questions of verticality, let's say, because there are verticality is a relationality as well, perhaps. Yeah. Thank you.